Some may say, let us leave the past in the past. Why not focus on the present and the future? Well, my dear brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals to the Prophet, and keep in mind that in Medina, there was a large Jewish diaspora. There was a sizable Jewish audience. And yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Prophet to bring up a very sensitive issue relating to the history of the Israelites. Now, the immediate audience of the Prophet, the Jews who were living in Medina, none of them were worshipping a golden calf. Yet, the Prophet is commanded to bring this historical event to light. The question is why? Why should we focus so much on the early history of Islam? Especially when we're dealing with a period in our history that is controversial, that is very sensitive, and that may fuel the flames of sectarian tension. You know, people often ask, why don't we just focus on messages of unity and community harmony? Why is it that we insist on addressing the past? Some may say, let us leave the past in the past. Why not focus on the present and the future? Well, my dear brothers and sisters, as Muslims, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Qur'an, He invites believers to reflect on the past. And sometimes we have to reflect on the ugly aspects of the past, because from the past we learn very important lessons. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to us in the Qur'an about the first murder that took place in human history, the murder that took place in the family, in the household of Adam alayhi salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to us about the iniquities of past nations. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Qur'an, He admonishes and He rebukes the children of Israel for the crimes of their ancestors. Now, if you look at these verses, especially the Madani verses, there are verses in the Qur'an where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Prophet to invoke some of the dark periods of the history of Bani Israel. For example, if we look at Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah number 2, verse 92, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals to the Prophet, and keep in mind that in Medina, there was a large Jewish diaspora. There was a sizable Jewish audience. And yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Prophet to bring up a very sensitive issue relating to the history of the Israelites. In ayah 92 of Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ مُوسَى بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ. Surely Moses came to you with clear signs. ثُمَّ اتَّخَذْتُمُ الْعِجْلَ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ وَأَنْتُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. And yet you took the calf as an object of worship while you were wrongdoers. Now, the immediate audience of the Prophet, the Jews who were living in Medina, none of them were worshipping a golden calf. Yet, the Prophet is commanded to bring this historical event to light. The question is why? It's because according to the Qur'an, a believer must condemn and disassociate from the wrongdoings of the past, even if those wrongs were committed by your own ancestors. If you are going to be a believer who condemns oppression and wrongdoing in the present, you have to first begin by addressing the wrongs of the past. So this is something that we see throughout the Qur'an, constantly taking our attention to the past. Because if we start to censor the crimes of the past, we will be more likely to censor the crimes of the present. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants the believer to disassociate from the oppressors and the criminals and those who perpetrated crimes in the past, so that in the present we can be true callers of justice. We can be true custodians of the truth. And the intention is not to engage in sectarian rhetoric. The intention is not to create a rift between our Sunni brothers and sisters. What we ultimately want is to create a community that sincerely seeks the truth and seeks to emulate the prophetic way. But in order for us to arrive at the true prophetic sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, we have to visit some of the uncomfortable periods of our past.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد